My name's Marion Ware, and I'm the interviewer today at the Taneytown Museum, and I'm interviewing George Naylor from Taneytown. George, would you just please say your name and also your age and where you live?
Okay, it's nice to be here this morning. Nice to meet you folks. And my name is George Naylor. That's spelled Naylor. And I live at 310 Taney Drive in Taneytown, Maryland. Lived here since 1945.
1945.
Lived in Taneytown since 1945. Prior to that, I was born and raised on a farm just a few miles from Taneytown. And Taneytown used to be the area where we'd come in a Model T Ford pickup truck and pick up food for the animals out on our farm. We would bring in a couple of bags of grain, which was in the kernel form, bring it to a mill. They would grind it and put other things with it, and we'd take home twice as much as we brought in because they would add to what we brought in.
Okay, and did you, how long, was this your parents' farm?
My mom and dad had a farm in about 8 miles away from Taneytown, and we would use Taneytown for our milling of grains for our animals that we fed our animals out on the farm.
Where did your parents come from originally? How did they get to the United States? Do you know your...
Well, my folks were natives of this country. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was many years, many generations ago that relatives of our family came from England, and most of them from England. So I don't really have any close relations from the other countries.
How old are you now, George?
In 3 weeks, in fact, the 13th of July of this year, 2016, I will be 90. Health is fairly good. I've had both knees replaced, both hips replaced, but I've recovered very quickly from all of those and just keep going.
Yeah, you look like you have a lot of energy, and because you're 90, you're also going to have a lot of history to tell us.
I'm an outside guy. I can't sit in a chair and look out the window. I have to be outside doing something, mowing, pulling weeds, or something along that line.
All right, so let's go back to the farm in terms of, you said you brought the grain in to the mill, or you brought the corn in? Is that right?
We would bring shelled corn in to be ground up and have supplements added to our corn after it had been ground by the mill here in Taneytown, and we would take home twice as many bags as we brought in. Now the mills, we had two big mills in Taneytown, one on each side of the railroad, down where the police building or site is now. There was one mill on that site. The other mill was right across the railroad from that one, and part of that building is still there, but the front part of it has been torn down. And naturally, where the police station is now, the whole building was turned down. Now those mills had elevators in them. They were big buildings, tall. For Taneytown in those days, the mill building was big. And farmers would bring their grain in to have it milled and take home extra.
Do you know about when both of the mills ceased to exist?
Yeah, that was around the 1890s. Mm-hmm. We had, well, in a little bit, I would like to tell a little bit about the town in general, but those mills were two of the largest buildings in Taneytown in those years, in the 1890s to 1900s.
Okay, so let's talk about the town. So you're talking about the mills, but let's talk a little bit
Okay,
about the town.
I would, instead of being interviewed on individual items like buildings and people and stores and that sort of thing. I spent 20 years on the city council in Taneytown, so I'm a little bit familiar with the growth of Taneytown, and I thought I would like to just cover a little bit about how Taneytown grew through the years, even going back to 1735 and 1750, when the first settlers came down here out of Pennsylvania and started to locate around the intersection up in the middle of our town where two roads crossed, intersected. You had the road from Washington to Frederick to Philadelphia, and then there was that was our main road through Taneytown. Then the secondary road was from Baltimore to Hagerstown. That wasn't really developed and became a major road until many years afterwards. As I said, these roads were here in 1750 when the people started to settle around and form Taneytown. The beginning of Taneytown was at that intersection when a family or so started to locate around this intersection of two roads. Now, let's talk about how Taneytown might have developed or did develop. We only had two streets through Taneytown, the two main highways. Buildings and houses started to be built right along the street. And if you look at our town today, you'll find that everything is right out against the sidewalk. As the town developed and back streets developed, you would get into the setback of buildings where a house couldn't be closer than 20, 25 feet from a sidewalk. So in the very beginning, naturally, the people that settled here had nothing. They had no water, they had no sewer, they had no police, there were no streets. They were just living here in an individual house, starting their life. As the years developed, they needed water. So during the years of 1800s, a series of wells were drilled back in Pump House Alley. Now that's behind the current day where Commerce Street is located. There was about a half a dozen wells back there that were about 100 feet deep. Wells never were dug more than 100 feet deep in those days. And the water that came out of these wells went into what we would say today was a cistern, just a big cement box in the ground, part of it out of the ground. That was our storage for water in the late 1700s, going into the 1800s, and not much water was used because there was only a few homes located along the main streets in Taneytown, from the so-called square back maybe a block or so. There was no sanitary sewer, so people had the outdoor toilet, like we're all familiar with today. They call them one whores and two whores and things of that nature, you know. But there was no sanitary sewers. In fact, as late as 1945, there was no sanitary sewers in Taneytown. My folks built a house in Taneytown in 1945, and they had to build a septic tank. There was no public sewage system in Taneytown until the late 1940s. Going back now to as Taneytown developed, I always like to think about the first 200 years of Taneytown being the old, not old part, but the old way of living. Everything was done manually. Stores were mom and pop stores. They got into leather products. We made guns in this town, not by factories, just by someone having a little shop sitting in the back or beside of their house. We had people who made wooden chairs and rocking chairs. We had people that made clocks. Now, I'm not talking about factories. I'm talking about a little shop beside the house or sitting behind the house on their lot. It was only in the 1950s that the man who made slog and hop chairs, his workshop was torn down out on the Otterdale Mill Road. So like I said, everything was manual, and everything was manual from 1750 to World War II. Nothing happened much in that 200-year period. Everything was manual. However, there was a lot of big buildings built in the 1880s, 90s, 1900s. The big buildings on the square, the mills, some of our largest buildings that we had in Taneytown, and some of them are going today, but those buildings were all built back in the late 1800s and the around 1900. I like to think of this 200-year period as just plain tough living, manual. Everything had to be made manually, and everything was family operated, mom and pop. So now we can move into what happened after World War II. I came into Taneytown in 1945. My mother and dad were farmers. They retired into Taneytown in 1945. I went into the Navy. I spent 2 years in the Navy, and when I returned, I lived in Taneytown. So the city was my home. And that's when I started to really learn about things in Taneytown. Come the 1960s and 70s, I spent 20 years in city government in Taneytown, so I know a little bit about how Taneytown operated and what happened in Taneytown from the very beginning, because we talked about this sort of thing, learned about this sort of thing, and then after World War II, the 1940s, 45, then we became a part of the city we lived in. Starting in the 1946 area, when I come back into Taneytown, I went to work for a shoe company. Well, in fact, when I returned home, I was going to return to the Navy and make it a 20-year retirement type of deal. But family worked on me and tried to talk me into staying in Taneytown. And then a personnel director from the shoe company, at that time was the Cambridge Rubber Company, and incidentally, that plant started out as a Carroll Shoe Company, and it burned. It came into Taneytown in the 37s. It burned in 42, and 43 it opened up under a new name of Cambridge Rubber Company. And of course, when I went to work for it, the name was Cambridge Rubber Company, and had no idea how long I was going to work there. Turned out I gave them 42 years, my entire life. So let's start thinking about what happened to Taneytown after World War II. This is a period of time, it's only been 75 years, that I like to say that Taneytown has become the modern town compared to small municipalities out in the country. Things started to change in Taneytown after World War II. We started to have houses started to be built. We were thinking then about streets and everything that goes along to administer the affairs within a city. You have to have committees. It just doesn't run on its own. A town has to have people who are qualified to operate areas. For instance, the city government used to send tax bills out to the property holder at the end of the tax year. Well, all during the year, they had to borrow money to operate. Well, eventually, starting in the 50s, a group from the city council who were a little more qualified in conducting the affairs of a town and business said we're going to start billing tax bills the first of the year so we didn't have to borrow money and operate off of borrowed money for the year. And then the budgetary process started. We made committees operate on budgets. They couldn't overspend their money, and we never borrowed money. So this was a difference between the 200 years that I talked about prior to the war and the beginning of a new 75-year period starting in the late 40s. Buildings started to come to Taneytown. Houses started to become Taneytown. We started to get business. We had some large business out along the Emmitsburg Road, Lion Brothers, Flowserve. Then along the Frederick Road, we had the air conditioning company, Evapco, and there's a large woodwork company back there. And people started to come into Taneytown. During the war, the shoe company hired as many as 1,000 employees at one time during the war. Well, you can understand what 1,000 people meant to Taneytown each day. Parking, the company had 4 and 5 buses, which they gave to drivers who were employees. These drivers would pick up a busload of people out where they lived, bring them to work. Everybody would work a day. They'd go home at night on the bus. And this is the way we got people into the plant during those years when they had 1,000 people working together. 4 and 5 buses would bring 4 and 5 busloads of employees into the plant every day.
And were they getting these employees from surrounding
communities where these drivers would pick them up in the morning, just like a school bus system would be today. They picked up employees.
Right. Were they young in the majority?
Yeah.
All ages?
All ages, yeah.
Okay.
There wasn't a family in Taneytown that wasn't impacted by the shoe company.
So it sounds like a company town.
It was a company town.
Yeah.
How these factories got to town, how they started these factories, in the late 30s, 37, 38, the people started to say, we don't have any jobs. We need work. The Chamber of Commerce set up a committee to look for work. Their first business that they obtained was a company out of Baltimore, H. Bornstein and Sons, who made suits. They located on Broad Street in Taneytown. They employed up to about 150 people, mostly women, because it was sewing machine work and a sewing factory. The next year, they were able to contact a company that was in New England, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So they sent a couple of their top men to Taneytown to look over the area. And after several days of talking, they accepted Taneytown as a site for a small business. They started out with about 35 men. They wound up with 1,000 during the 40s, after the fire in 43. Now, that's a lot of people to be employed in a small town.
Some of it was because of the war? Were they manufacturing?
The company made things for the military. They made heavy boots for the Army, the Navy. They made ponchos. They made, basically, they made rubber footwear in the summer for winter wear all over the country. And they made winter wear in the winter for the next year. This was the way they operated. Winter wear they made in the summer, summer wear they made in the winter. And we warehoused for some of the largest wholesalers and retailers in the United States. Sears and Roebuck, Penny, Beck, all those outfits. They would give us a year's worth of sales. We would manufacture it and warehouse it. We warehoused shoes in barns, sheds, anything that was empty, we would rent and put shoes in it. Back in those days, there wasn't a place in Taneytown that didn't have shoes from Cambridge Rubber stored in it.
So George, I know another piece of the history that you know quite a bit about and that people are very interested in are the canning factories. And there was a canning factory here in Taneytown, correct? Can you tell us about that?
In fact, we had 2 canning factories in Taneytown. One was located on Roberts Mill Road, up where the senior center is now. And that was a Nussbaum canning factory. They canned tomatoes and beans and corn. There was another canning factory right at the edge of town on the Littlestown Road, York Street, and that was the A.W. Feeser canning factory. A.W. Feeser owned a lot of farms. They needed a lot of help to pick tomatoes, pull corn, and pull beans. We had no machines that picked corn, that kind of sort of thing, so they looked for anyone that would do the work. They used to come out through the country and gather up the farm boys throughout the area because farm boys didn't mind going to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and getting all wet, pulling corn and picking tomatoes. When you had to pick tomatoes, you couldn't wait till noon when everything dried off. You know, it was tough to find people who was willing to pick tomatoes and pull corn when it was wet and the ground was muddy. That's the way life went on. Now, A.W. Feeser, I used to work for them, make a few dollars in this. I didn't work full time. It was a job where you made a little spending money off the farm. And I used to pull corn or pick tomatoes from out on the farm. And it was a big operation. They had machines, they'd run their corn through it, would take the outside husk off, and the tomatoes. It was strange. These canning factories also canned tomatoes from afar. People like from the Eastern Shore would bring truckloads of tomatoes up here to be canned. And juice would be running out the back of them when they'd get here. These trucks were not box trucks and closed. They were just open with racks along the side. So the juice would run out of them and they'd sit in line waiting to be unloaded at these canning factories, and it was a mess. Canning factories were kind of messy in those days because a lot of juice was running around on the ground. Canning factories, all gone today. They weren't around very long because as things progressed, factories grew, equipment was made, and they didn't need people anymore. So eventually, canning factories disappeared.
What did you do with your spending money that you got?
We saved a lot of it. We were very conservative and frugal in those days. We didn't have money. And a nickel was an important thing. I'd go to a festival at night. My parents would give me a quarter. I could buy 5 things with a quarter and get sick on it. You know, everything was a nickel. So 5 things was a lot for a little kid, 6 years old, 5 years old. We could get sick on a quarter. We had no money. Women made dresses out of feed sacks. Men was able to buy dungarees. They didn't call them dungarees then, they called them overalls. And they had bibs on them. Like I said, you didn't buy much at stores, you made stuff. And everything was handmade, and you didn't spend much money. Most farmers, when they get a few dollars, they'd buy another piece of equipment. Now we're talking about the 30s. This was during the 30s yet, just prior to World War II. Farmers had no equipment in those days. You did everything with horse and fork and shovel. So let's move on a little further into the 50s. Okay, we get into the 1950s or 60s. Houses started to appear in Taneytown. You'd have to build an extra street back somewhere. I bought a house, I bought a site in a hayfield. The hay was waist high. A guy had a field, he wanted to start selling some lots. He heard I was looking for a lot. He took me to the field and I said, well, I'm a farm boy, I gotta have a garden. I can't build a house on a lot 100 by 125. I gotta have it takes that much for a house. I want a place where I can have a garden. So he showed me an area where I could have a big garden. I bought it, I'm still living there today, and that was in '55. City government got into the need for organizations. They needed a street committee. They needed water committee. They needed a sewer committee. They needed maintenance. They needed an office. All kinds of needs was needed by city government starting after World War II. In the 60s, we had no police department. I was asked to chair and start a police department in Taneytown. We hired a man or two. We had to uniform them. We had to buy equipment for them. We had to buy a car. And each year you try to improve the service in a police department. I'm talking now about a police department because that was a real close thing for me. We had no office. I used to work in my garden and the police would come down into my garden at night and we'd talk while I was working down there. We would talk about the complaints that would come up during the daytime, the problems, and we would solve a lot of problems down in my vegetable garden in the evening while I was working. So as the years would pass, you know, we had to have an office. So we started an office. We started equipment. And of course today, you know the nice police office and building that we have right along the railroad. Now, you know, that's the way it has developed from the 1960s to 2016. And everything in Taneytown has developed like that from the 60s and the 70s to now 2016. We had street committees. We had to start building streets. Developers came in. We had to get streets in town. We started with, well, in the very beginning, there were no hard streets, They just used gravel on the main streets, dusty, dirty. As the years proceeded, we went to tar and chips. Well, tar and chips, the final coat was just rough, loose stone. They rolled around after it was finished. The stones rolled off to the side. That was replaced by blacktop. So today, you know, we have blacktop streets. That's the way the street committee worked, from nothing to today's streets as we have them. Water and sewer, they would purchase equipment, make repairs, extend new lines, and each committee had to build what we have today, from nothing to what we have today. This is what the 75-year period has brought our city after World War II to 2016. Today, even all these committees work differently today. You have high-tech people working today. You have your computers in your offices. Everything is completely changed, and this is progress. That's why I like to say World War II was the difference between the old and the new. What's the next 50 years going to be? Who knows?
How do you think it affects this idea that it's progress, all of this new high technology development, the necessity for government to become more organized? How does that affect the town? How does that affect the people that live here? I mean, what is the difference, do you think? Is it really progress? Or what do you think are the advantages and the disadvantages in terms of the difference?
In the very beginning, up until the 1950s, our churches were all full. I go to a church that when I started there, it was elbow to elbow. They had to add a big educational building for the Sunday school to operate in. That was during the 40s, the 50s. People went to church. It was a social affair. Not just the people in Taneytown, but the outlying farmers all came to Taneytown. Keep in mind that this is a rural area, agriculture. People in the early days had no place to go. Church was the only place that people went in the early days. From the very beginning up until the 30s, the 20s, the 30s, people went to church. Today, our churches are empty in Taneytown. We have 6 churches in Taneytown. The old people are gone. The new people do not use our churches. Most of our churches are empty, and it's a problem, and no one knows how to solve this problem. They are talking about it, but people are not going to church today.
That was their social
network. It used to be the social network. When church was over, you'd stand around and talk, and talk about what happened in the week, what's going to happen next week. Today, people don't have time. It's go in the door and come out the door, and there's just very little togetherness anymore in that. And people are wondering what's going to happen to our churches. Recreation is a big thing in Taneytown today. Taneytown has one of the best parks and recreation programs and equipment that any town could have. It's full all the time. Teams can't schedule any additional games. Everything is programmed. And this is where our youngsters go today to the parks to play ball. All of them are involved in some form of playground activity. Incidentally, for anyone that might be interested in knowing a lot about history of Taneytown, there is a book that the Taneytown Museum has. Here's a picture of it. It is outstanding. It has a lot of history in about the old Taneytown. There's hardly anything in here about new Taneytown. It's just about the old buildings, the old parts of town, the old folks. And I would suggest that if you're interested in Taneytown, get a copy of this at the Taneytown Museum at 340 East Baltimore Street, and you would really enjoy this book.
Thank you. Can I ask just a couple more questions in terms of sort of more personal pieces? I know you have a son, so I assume you're married. So when did you get married, and was that after you moved to town, or can you tell me a little bit about your family life?
No.
You mentioned your church.
Like I told you earlier, I went into the Navy and spent 2 years, and when I came home, it was in Taneytown. That was my actually new home. I was not a stranger to Taneytown, but I'd never lived here. I was not married while I was in the service. I got married in 1951. I would have been married 65 years in June of this year, but my wife, Betty, passed away in January of 2016. So I'm now by myself, and we had 2 children, a boy, Sydney, and a girl, Rhonda. Sydney, through education, wound up in Nashville, Tennessee, in the field of music. And our daughter, who went to college at Virginia Tech in Lower Virginia, settled back in Taneytown eventually and lives here today. Our daughter has 2 children, both of them, one of them married. Both the son is married and the daughter is not married. The boy, Sydney, who wound up in Nashville, Tennessee, has 2 sons, both married, both have children, so we have great-grandchildren in Tennessee, but no great-grandchildren in Maryland.
Do you ever have reunions or anything?
No, reunions have kind of died off. My parents, my wife's parents, all had family reunions. We all attended. After that older generation disappeared, my generation didn't have reunions. And our children are not having reunions. So, you know, reunions have kind of disappeared too. Overall.
I think people keep in touch with Facebook now and photos and that sort of thing.
Facebook is a big thing. Now, in my particular family, we used to try to get the family together for special occasions, Christmas, once in a while, birthdays and that sort of thing. We had a close-knit family, and even though they got away at a distance, we do get together quite often, and we're still a close-knit family.
If there's, being that you're 90, and you certainly don't look 90 by any means, what is the thing that you think, in terms of your life, what you would say was kind of the most valuable lesson about living this long?
I was always used to working. I never was one that shied away from work. I never had a day that I didn't want to go to work because I didn't want to work. I gave the company I worked for 42 years. I enjoyed it. I liked the people. I liked the company. As I said, there wasn't a day ever that I didn't want to go to work. That might be unusual. That's just me. I always was an outside person. I liked things outside as hobby work. And life has been good to me. We've had a good family, close family.
And you've been connected to a lot of people in town. You've been very active as far as even with the Taneytown Museum. So you have a lot to be proud of.
I like
George.
people, and I am still involved in Taneytown. I'm a member of the Planning and Zoning Committee. I'm downsizing a lot. I have even downsized with the museum, an area that I really liked and helped to organize and get started. But I can't do things today anymore that I can't do everything that I liked. But there's a few items that I still hang on to if I can. I'm still a docent at the museum. I'm a member of the Planning and Zoning in Taneytown, and I want to hang on to those as long as I can. Those are my last two items. I'm active in the church, and have always been. Personally, I've had a good life. I guess I'm just a homeboy. Have lived in little rural Taneytown all my life, and never got into the big city or wished I had got into the big city.
Thank you, George.
Glad to be here.